In the wake of Hurricane Beryl, after millions of Houstonians lost power and at least 36 people died, many of them because they didn't have air conditioning in the heat following the storm, Texans were once again left with many of the same questions we've been asking for the past decade. How do we make sure that the power stays on when a storm hits or disaster strikes? How can our state, rich in energy resources, have its electric grid so consistently fail after extreme weather events? This one a Category 1 hurricane. When we are faced with the inevitable next storm, hurricane, or cold snap, how will we make sure things are different? How can we keep critical facilities powered, vulnerable residents safe, and generally ensure a reliable and resilient grid? For CenterPoint, the utility serving most of the Houston area, the response so far has been underwhelming, and it includes purchasing or leasing additional generators, most of which, the vast majority of which, did not work following Hurricane Beryl. This approach has been met with a lot of skepticism, given CenterPoint had spent $800 million on generators previously, a cost that will be borne by customers for many years to come. But there are alternative solutions that can enhance community resilience without breaking the bank. One of the most promising is microgrids. Microgrids consist of interconnected resources like solar panels, batteries, gas generators that connect directly to homes, critical facilities, and other sites, allowing them to operate independently from the main grid. Microgrids have been deployed across the state, including in Houston, and customers with microgrids during Beryl had drastically different experiences than others in the city and the region. To learn more about microgrids and understand how they can help save lives and maintain stability in future storms, I spoke with Allan Schurr, the COO of Enchanted Rock, which has been deploying microgrids for almost 20 years. 100% of Enchanted Rock's microgrids that were tasked with providing power during the Beryl aftermath were able to do so successfully, including their microgrids at HEB stores and distribution centers, which also stayed up post-Uri. HEB has become a resilience hub of sorts. Allan and I dug into how Enchanted Rock's microgrids work and what types of customers are currently served by them. We talked about how microgrids can and should be deployed at nursing homes, hospitals, and other critical facilities, why the company chose to switch from natural gas generators away from diesel fuel, the impact of state legislation on microgrid deployment, and how utilities can make it easier for all types of customers to get microgrids. This one is part of a larger series I'm doing in the aftermath of Hurricane Beryl, focused on microgrids. In the next few weeks, we'll be releasing shorter episodes like this one, interviewing folks working on solar microgrids and storage, understanding the impact of natural disasters on marginalized communities, the importance of DERs, and much more. To stay up to date on all this, please be sure to subscribe to the Energy Capital podcast and the Texas Energy and Power newsletter at douglewin.com. That's DOUGLEWIN.com. And of course, don't forget to share the podcast and give a 5-star review wherever you listen. Thanks for being a listener, and I hope you enjoy this episode of the Energy Capital podcast. Allan Schurr of Enchanted Rock, welcome to the Energy Capital podcast.
Boy, it's great to be on, and nice to see you again.
Good to see you again as well. Obviously been following Enchanted Rock for a lot of years now. When did you guys start? It's more than 10 years now, right?
Oh, more than 10 years. Yeah, we really got into this business of resiliency in 2009. So we're 15 years in, and we've learned a lot along the way, but it's exciting where we're at now.
Was there a formative, that was right after Hurricane Ike? Was there something that really spurred it, or had this kind of been building for a while and 2009 just happened to be the year it started?
Well, Hurricane Ike was kind of the catalyst for doing what we do today, because as you may recall, Ike really impacted the city of Houston. The water infrastructure in the city was very close to being lost in terms of power reliability, caused them very close to losing that entire water operation. And so that created a demonstrated need, and our founder, Thomas McAndrew, in partnership with NRG, started working with the city of Houston, building backup power systems, at that time using diesel generators, but with a more modular design, a little smarter operations mode. And from there, we started adding more sites. We added more market-facing operations, and in 2014, decided that we needed to pivot to a cleaner solution that also had the benefit of the underground fuel delivery network of natural gas. And so we engineered and designed a proprietary gas engine for backup power that we're still using. We're on about the 10th version of it, but we're using that same exact approach today, and now have over 1,500 of these generators in the market.
Amazing. So we'll dig into all of that. So interesting. It started after Ike. Obviously, we're recording, summer 2024. A couple weeks after Hurricane Beryl has come through Houston, a couple months after the derecho, which also caused massive outages in Houston. So two major hits just in the last couple of months. You wrote a little piece on LinkedIn. We'll link to it in the show notes, and folks should definitely follow Allan and all things Enchanted Rock. But you wrote there, it's no longer about preparing for the possibility of long duration outages from severe weather year round. It's about preparing for the inevitable. So this is really kind of built into the DNA of the company, that these long duration outages are going to happen, and microgrids are a core solution. Let's start with, if you don't mind, kind of an expansive definition of like what are microgrids, why are they so important, and then as we go through the conversation, we'll narrow down to what exactly Enchanted Rock is doing. But I think it's good to level set, because people use that word a lot, and it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So I think definitions matter here.
Yeah, a microgrid is a self-contained, geographically contained boundary that can be supplied from energy resources within that boundary in the case that it needs to island from the grid. So it is a little mini grid. It's a little micro utility, and it is set up in such a way that it can operate when the grid is down. It can separate from the grid and carry necessary loads, all the loads, for as long as is needed until the grid is available again. And if you follow the DOE definition, it also means that it's grid aware, so that when the grid is connected, it also can provide some level of support to the wider grid. So that definition, of course, with the backdrop of Beryl, means that customers that have microgrids should be able to operate normally for the duration of any power interruption from the grid. And I think maybe just keying off the long duration statement, long duration means what? Really, is also a design question. Is long duration enough for you to evacuate patients from a hospital? Or is long duration so that you don't have to evacuate patients from a hospital? Those kinds of examples. And we know from experience, having started working with diesel backup generation, that during real emergencies, it's very difficult to get refueled. And so long duration is really what you expect an outage can be, and comparing that to the ability to store fuel on site or have enough self-sustaining resources on site that you don't need refueling. That's what we mean by long duration, being prepared for those very long periods where something happens that you weren't necessarily expecting, but in fact they compound. Often in emergencies, things get difficult. So with Beryl, we had customers that were out for 11 days, and it was long past the ability to get refueling after 24 hours of fuel is used.
Yeah, so that islanding piece is really kind of the key. And I think, we have a lot of different kinds of listeners to this podcast. Some are definitely energy professionals, and some are kind of newer to this and want to understand that better. But really, it is what it sounds like, right? You have the ability to continue to have power within a defined area beyond when grid goes down. You guys have, I believe I read, I think it was either and we'll link to various articles about Enchanted Rock. It was either the Microgrid Knowledge or Canary. Both had good articles about y'all recently, but one of them had that you guys have 155 sites in Houston. Something like 95% of those stayed up throughout Beryl the entire time. You guys have a number of different clients, but obviously one of your sort of marquee or signature clients is HEB. And it's very interesting that, Texans have come to view HEB sort of as a resilience center. They know when the, pardon my French, proverbial shit hits the fan, they can go to HEB and it's going to have air conditioning. Their food is going to be there. And you guys are a huge part of that story. Can you talk a little bit about that relationship? And I'm also just interested in who some of the other, you don't have to name names if they don't want to be named, but what are some of the other kinds of clients you're working with? Grocery stores, but are you working with hospitals? Are you working with, water treatment facilities, assisted living centers? What other kinds of facilities are you working with?
Right, right. And let me just say that we have 155 microgrids in the Houston area. 146 of them were asked to be operated for outage purposes. So there were 9 of our microgrids the grid was still up. We operated at 100% of the microgrids where we were asked to provide backup power. So
thanks for that correction, because that's a really important correction. So I know you guys take a lot of pride in having 100%. So I get it. Yeah,
we do, and I think it's important to note that when people want to pay for resiliency, that they get it. And it's difficult to actually ascertain what the level of performance is from so many different options that are out there. But we think that being able to provide that level of continuity of service allows companies like HEB, as an example, and I'll talk about some of the other customer types that we support. It lets them count on the fact that power will always be there. And indeed, what HEB used to try to do, this is dating back probably nearing 10 years ago, they had a fleet of mobile diesel generators that they would try to roll around the state looking for where to be when the storm hit. And so they had to be both weather forecasters, they had to be logistics experts, which they are, and then they had to be lucky that they hit the right locations. And if you think about Beryl was supposed to go ashore at Brownsville, and then 3 days later it was in Houston. It's difficult, and Hannah was very similar to that a few years back. So it's very difficult to move equipment around during emergencies. Often those emergencies are causing road closures and other things. So HEB can now count on the fact that they'll have continuous operations of power, and that lets them run their business a little differently. Yes, the branding of we're there for the community is part of their DNA, but it also lets them push perishables out to their stores rather than hoard them at their distribution centers and then move them to the stores that have power. They don't have to deal with that level of complexity, so they can continue to operate as normal and even forward stage some of that perishables at their store locations. That lets them be more responsive to their community. We do serve other grocery stores that have interest in being known as a community resource center, but we also do assisted living facilities, hospitals. Assisted living facilities requirement for life safety does not include air conditioning. So while you might be able to
wait, hold on. Okay, wait. So there's a definition in some standard for assisted living centers or something? What are you referring to that doesn't include air conditioning?
Yeah, so there's actually an NFPA standard for life safety. Backup generators have to be on site, but they don't have to cover the entire load of the facility. They have to cover things like elevators and emergency exit lighting and things of that sort. But having full backup that a microgrid can provide lets them just maintain operations and not evacuate patients. Heat's really a problem, right? When you're sheltering in place,
yes,
and the air conditioner
particularly at an assisted living facility or nursing home, right? I mean, heat is literally a killer. I mean, it can kill anybody, but certainly elderly people are at a very high level of risk.
Right. So healthcare is generally that. Most healthcare standards don't require full facility backup. It's partial. And we have a hospital customer that they had to evacuate patients during Harvey because they lost power. And while their emergency generators worked for a while, they really needed to remove the most critically ill patients for other locations. That's not healthy for the patient. So a microgrid can solve that problem. Water pumping, water facilities, if we remember out of Uri, there was a lot of power outages and water supplies were compromised. And so boil water notices occurred. I think I read that there were more water outages than there were power outages in Texas during Uri. So water is another one of those critical infrastructures. We've got some manufacturing customers, some that make food products that need refrigeration. We have a chemical plant out in Baytown area, and they have environmental releases if they have power outages that cause their process to be interrupted artificially. And by having a microgrid, they can avoid those releases, and indeed, they can continue to operate. It takes them sometimes over a week to recover from an outage. And I can give many, many stories of the kinds of things that are obvious, and then some non-obvious ones, too, that customers that just have a very high consequence of having power outages. And microgrids address that so that they don't have to worry about it. They can maintain their operation. They can maintain the safety and quality of their products. They can serve their customers better, whether they're shoppers or patients or others.
It's very interesting that you said that, in the very early days, more than 10 years ago, HEB was rolling mobile generators around, because it seems like, and I'll get into a little bit of commentary, and you don't have to endorse, or you could certainly push back if you don't agree. But a lot of the things that
I know where you're going.
Well, look, I mean, so this is a very live issue, right? There was an article, again, we'll link to this in the show notes with a gift link. Great article by Nina Satija and Mike Morris of the Houston Chronicle about the mobile generators that CenterPoint has purchased. They spent $800 million on them the day we're recording on July 25th. There was a PUC hearing today. The PUC seems to think that maybe doing more generators, but as long as they're small, would be better. But even if they're small, even if they could be used, unlike the big 32 megawatt ones that cost most of the money that they couldn't use post Beryl, even if they get smaller ones, how long does it take to actually get those generators there? How many of the needed, when 80% of your service territory, your CenterPoint was without power post Beryl, how do you pick and choose which assisted living center and which nursing home and which water treatment plant get a small generator? And then on top of that, that's ratepayer dollars that are only being used on the few days out of the year when there is an emergency, whereas your systems are already on site. So the minute there's a problem and there's an outage, like not even the minute, that's inaccurate, right? I mean, like the sub-second that there's an outage, it kicks on. Yes. It's immediate. And you can actually be generating power, reducing electric bills all through the year. So I think it's very interesting that there's a parallel there, that like HEB learned this lesson 10 years ago, but it seems like the state might still be learning it now. I'll let you comment on that, but I'll turn this into a question. The state did pass what I think is a pretty groundbreaking policy during the last session. It was Senate Bill 2627. It put money towards big central station gas plants, but also had funding for microgrids at critical facilities. Now, that's a little different because you guys are focused on gas. This mandates a mix of solar, storage, and gas. Is this something you're tracking? Do you think that is a policy that can really make a difference to add reliability and resiliency to the state? Do you think it needs any changes? What are your thoughts about this sort of these? I think there are kind of two different ways to go. One is these kind of mobile generators that seem pretty unwieldy and difficult and lead to all sorts of difficult decisions, versus the kind of on-site generation that's there year-round that's in the Texas Energy Fund.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack, as they say, in that question. First of all, I think it's important to state that all of the debate that's going on now post Beryl, it's healthy to realize that the grid does take a hit and can't be at the level of reliability that certain customers need. And no matter what you do with tree trimming and other moves, there still is vulnerability with above ground infrastructure and even below ground infrastructure. So having local generation at the site of critical infrastructure, I think we agree on that as a necessary aspect of maintaining the operations of those customers, whatever they are. Then the question is, how's the best way to do that? Mobile generators have historically been used for those kinds of applications. They're also used for construction power and other things that are clearly temporary applications. But it's hard to say that in coastal Texas that it's a temporary risk of having an outage. It's a long-term risk because it can happen from a variety of storms, not just hurricanes, but the derecho and other severe weather. So it's a long-term risk that maybe demands a longer-term solution. And you throw in the logistics challenge of moving mobile generators around, and it really should be the exception, not the rule, for critical infrastructure where there's something that was not anticipated and it needs a quick fix. Just the manpower of moving during an emergency this equipment, connecting it, testing it, takes time. It could be hours or even days before it can be made safe to move that kind of equipment around.
And then having enough diesel to actually, to your point earlier, right? I mean, having enough diesel to go for days and days like that is a major issue as well.
So I think it's deficient for the kinds of infrastructure that knows there's a long-term risk to their operation in Texas or anywhere for that matter. So a permanent microgrid does start up immediately and it can run indefinitely. And the benefits of that are many. It actually helps utilities have a much more orderly way of restoring power. They don't have to worry about a particular customer that didn't have a backup generator that is pleading for some assistance from the utility, because that customer is protected, and the utility will know that they're protected, and they can go about their business of restoring the most customers the fastest, rather than a few customers that might divert resources. That's healthy for the grid restoration process. It should not be on the utility to provide resiliency to every customer at the level that some of those customers need. I think those that recognize they have that need really have an obligation to investigate solutions, and that's what the state incentive program was really designed around. It was to assist those businesses, those organizations, find a solution. It does require a number of conditions to be met that I think at this time it might make sense to modify that legislation for at least the coastal areas where the risks are the highest. And honestly, adding solar and storage, while is an admirable goal, doesn't really add to the resiliency of a site. If you need generation, you can never count on the fact an outage will happen with the battery charged if you're using it for other reasons. And even if you're not, it's very expensive to add solar and storage and generation, when generation can be the lowest cost approach. So we're advocating for some modifications for a temporary period of time, and only near coastal risk areas where that monies can be modified to be accelerated in their deployment in a much simpler way. And we could cover a lot of critical infrastructure with the dollars that were allocated to that program. And so we're hopeful that there will be some opportunity to advocate for that change. And I think many of the at-risk facilities that are critical infrastructure could very well in the next year be much more prepared for these long-duration outages, and that are, again, a persistent risk of being in Texas.
Yeah, very interesting. A lot to go into there too. I do though want to ask you some and I know you can't get into like great gory detail on your business model. Effectively, this is kind of a resilience as a service kind of a product. That's how I would describe it. I don't know. You could describe it differently, obviously, if you want to, but it's kind of this resiliency as a service, but where you're paying for the resiliency, but some of the cost is lower because the assets are actually participating in the market. So you guys are actually earning some ancillary service revenues. But a lot of discussion, I've covered it in my newsletter a lot, about the cost of ancillary services. So that's another benefit that microgrids, as opposed to things like, not to beat up too much on mobile generators, but like any number of different solutions don't sort of check all the boxes that microgrids do, right? So another one is it can contribute to ancillary services, but then also your customers are getting some benefits by reducing their energy use, reducing even their for coincident peak charges, right? Their transmission charges. So there's sort of all these different benefits that come in. Can you just, again, without getting into too much about your specific business model, but that kind of notion of resilience as a service with the cost brought down by some of the revenues from the market?
Yeah, I think that the business model idea of, exactly where's the revenue and where are the benefits, how do the costs get allocated to different parties, that varies by customer in some cases. But let me just talk about the function of the microgrid. A microgrid, once it's there for that island function, it's an available resource that can help the grid when the grid is tight. And it should be wired up that way so that it is ready to support the grid when conditions require it. And you might argue, well, there's not very much of an impact by doing that. But we at Enchanted Rock, we're up to 1 gigawatt of contracted or installed projects. And 1 gigawatt is a material impact on the grid.
Allan, is that just in Texas, or is that across a broader geography?
It's across more states than that, but I think the Texas portion of that's probably over 600 megawatts.
I mean, that is a very large amount, because and this is really sort of gets to that notion of a virtual power plant, right? As you guys have all of these smaller sources, but you add them up, it's a big number.
I like to call it an aggregated power plant because there's nothing virtual about it. It's a power plant, just lots of them, and they're very responsive. And in the end, they're a lot more reliable because you're not dependent on a single big unit to perform in supporting a grid. We have many that are geographically diverse, and because they are first offsetting local customer load, we don't even have transmission constraints that are required in order to overcome in order to get that power to market. It starts in the market because it's displacing customer load. So it should be an important part of the the grid resiliency features that any grid operator looks to. And I believe ERCOT is happy with having a growing portfolio of distributed resources, not just central plants where the risk is a little bit higher. The costs, in fact, are even more competitive because we have two customers paying for that asset. We have the resiliency customer that needs backup power that's willing to pay their share of that. But then the grid is also willing to pay for those services. And when combined, they both get a better deal. So what could be better than it's a more reliable asset that is cheaper than the traditional approach, and it's even cleaner because it's natural gas, not diesel backup. There's many benefits, and we think that this model is over time going to change the architecture of the grid, where we rely a lot more on distributed generation for additional resource capacity. Some industries need to have this resiliency experience, and so they're willing to compensate those assets for that function.
Makes a lot of sense. So I also want to make sure we talk a little bit about the Winter Storm Uri experience. We've obviously talked about a little bit about the derecho and the recent hurricane, but obviously Winter Storm Uri was such a sort of epochal, just sort of such an important event in the history of Texas energy. Can you talk a little bit about your experience as Enchanted Rock operating these assets during Winter Storm Uri?
Yeah, unlike the hurricanes where there was a lot of physical damage in the distribution loop, where local generation was really critical, Uri, there was not that much physical damage to the grid. The damage, if you call it damage, was really the loss of central power generation. And so with rotating outages that ensued, customers experienced outages, but the lines locally were fine. So we did operate a very significant amount of our fleet during that 8-day period. 140 or so of our customers were at some point or another in a rotating outage, very similar number to what Hurricane Beryl had. We had no interruptions to the gas infrastructure. We ran continuously. We had a few instances where the cold temps caused some issues with the generators that we were able to resolve and pick back up. Those generators, when they were in rotating outages, were protecting our customers from seeing those rotating outages, be able to deliver their services just like we talked about before. And then when the grid was restored, they were still able to contribute back to the overall energy mix. So we were providing power back to the grid to help alleviate the pressure of additional rotating outages. And again, a microgrid can provide that service back to the grid. And because in our case, we were taking low pressure gas from the LDCs, we didn't see the kind of gas interruptions that happened with the high pressure gas lines and some of the bigger turbines that require high pressure gas. So we were very reliable, extremely good performance. Not perfect, but considering the circumstances, we were very happy with it. And we've learned a lot since then and gone through our own winterization program since that time. So I think whether it's these system emergencies that can cascade into rotating outages or local damage that needs a significant amount of work to restore power and therefore the duration of the outage can be less determined, microgrids protect that critical infrastructure. And it really, I think, is the obligation of a lot of those operators to investigate the feasibility of having a microgrid so that they don't become a burden on the grid during those times of restoration. In fact, they can continue to operate as normal.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So it's an interesting point, right? The gas plants, a lot of them lost. They had to go offline, some of them not because they froze, but because they couldn't get gas. And you're saying, but that's high pressure gas. And on the local distribution system, you don't have that. So how confident are you that in any kind of event like that, we get some polar vortex, God forbid, worse than Winter Storm Uri, you have complete confidence that that local distribution system will continue to deliver gas to the microgrids? Is there any concern about that? Any need for sort of redundancy on site or anything like that?
Well, it's both the availability of supply, but it's also how you buy gas. So we, as a reliability provider, we buy firm gas, so it is not interruptible. Where a lot of power plants can't afford firm gas, we can afford firm gas because our job, our first customer is our resiliency customer. And so when you're buying firm gas, you buy it with the expectation of not being interrupted like other industrials might be, or power plants. Where we need to, at larger scale, where we need to buy our own storage, we'll firm it up via bundled product from a shipper that can provide firm gas that way. So the local distribution gas utilities don't want to curtail gas. It causes significant problems, and they generally are therefore extremely reliable. And even the Texas Railroad Commission has come out and said, look, if you're supporting human needs, you are a high priority gas customer, even if there were curtailments that had to occur. So at least in the state of Texas and a lot of other places, firm gas is something you should expect. It doesn't mean that it's guaranteed. Nothing is guaranteed, but it's more reliable than trying to get delivery of fuel over icy roads. And we ran into that problem during Uri, where the drivers couldn't get to their trucks, the trucks couldn't get across the road. They got to the terminals, and the terminals were without power, so they couldn't even fill their trucks. Well, you can see what happens at that point. It's very difficult to manage it.
Yeah. So I want to ask you two more questions. The first one, you keep referring to your customers as resiliency customers, and I think that's a good sort of like framing and way to think about this. It seems to me like there's a weird sort of disconnect right now, where one of the biggest conversations in the state right now in the policy realm is the resiliency plans that the utilities are putting forward. CenterPoint's put forward one for 2-point-something billion, and Encore has one for $3 billion. They don't include anything related to microgrids. And I'm just wondering again, if like where we started with microgrids with a definition, like what is your sort of working definition of resiliency? How is it different from reliability? And could the state really have a resiliency plan that could work without microgrids? Like, it seems to me like it's got to be a pretty foundational part of it. And it's hard for me to conceptualize it not in there, but a lot of folks are talking about resiliency without it. I'm wondering what your thoughts are.
Well, I think the state needs to see microgrids as part of its resiliency plan, but whether the utilities should be in the resiliency microgrid business is an open question. CenterPoint has proposed a pilot to try to investigate whether a community microgrid, something that could provide permanent support of a geographic area that might be prone to transmission interruptions, as an example. There are these microgrids around the country. We're doing one in Chicago called the Bronzeville microgrid. And so there may be a role for the TDSPs to support microgrids as part of a resiliency plan, but the state very much should, and they are with the Texas Energy Fund and that resiliency grant program. We think some modifications, as I said earlier, would make it a more impactful program and really address the immediacy of needs along the coastal region of Texas. So I think there are utilities around the country that do, in fact, do microgrids as part of an offering for their customers. We're working with Entergy on that, just over the border in Louisiana, but they're vertically integrated. And so they have a need for dispatchable capacity as well as to serve their local customers.
No, that's a really useful distinction, right? And this is one of the problems that a lot of folks, and I count myself in this camp, have with the utilities owning mobile generators, is they're supposed to be poles and wires. Generators are supposed to generate in the Texas market. There's supposed to be a bright line there. So maybe the key is in a resiliency plan to, like, you have a portion of it that's about their capital expenditures they earn a rate of return on. And then there's a portion of it. So that would be things like replacing their wooden poles with composite poles and things like that. And then there's a part that is not a rate of return, tree trimming, but like in there right next to tree trimming should be helping customers that want to have generators get interconnected quickly, and things like that. Like, is there what is the utility role? Not in Texas, not going to be owning the microgrid except in some rare circumstances. But what is the role of the utility to facilitate that? Is there something the utility can do to make this easier for customers?
They sure can. Being able to facilitate the interconnection process, orderly and speedy fashion, would help a lot too. There are expenses associated with interconnecting that might make sense for the utility to put in rate base because they support many microgrids or many distributed energy customers. So there's a little of that conversation that's happening too. But by and large, the market mechanisms in ERCOT exist to make resiliency affordable. And if we can tap into some of this sort of artificial boost money from the state, I think we can have widespread adoption of microgrids. The gas infrastructure is terrific. We haven't had any issues with Beryl. We didn't have any issues with Uri. It is underground, and it's really protected from most of the hazards that exist to the electric infrastructure. So we've got this terrific gas infrastructure. We should tap that for resiliency. We could see thousands of critical infrastructure businesses and government operations protected so that we can maintain a little bit more semblance of normalcy when we're restoring power for the rest of the masses. And they will get power back faster if there's, priority from the utilities on rapid restoration rather than moving crews from here to there because there's a customer that, is not protected. Critical infrastructure is critical. It should be recognized as critical. They should invest in resiliency. And there's an affordable option out there with microgrids.
Yeah, absolutely. Last question I want to ask you about. I was intrigued. There was an article I saw recently, a bridge to grid. I think this is a data center solution. We're seeing this problem all over the country, including in Texas. There's just these very large demands that are coming on quickly. Maybe we're not able to build enough transmission distribution infrastructure or generation or whatever to be able to support that data center. You guys are actually citing microgrids that can power that data center for a period of time. And then once it is grid connected, basically provide backup service. Did I get that right? What do you want to add to that? I think this whole AI data center thing is fascinating. And it's interesting. You guys are playing a role there too.
Well, the size of these data center requests are so large that it does take time for them to get connected. But that microgrid model that I described, backup power, some level of grid support, can also be used for prime power for a period of a few years while they're waiting for that interconnection so that they can get busy on their business. Again, the gas infrastructure in Texas is very robust. We can supply enough gas to do that. Then the data center can start building out, then connect to the grid when the grid is available. And from that point forward, they enjoy the benefits of a microgrid for backup that, again, more reliable than diesel-fueled backup generators, which in an emergency, you're not going to be able to get refilled very easily.
Very interesting. Looking forward to learning more about that in the fullness of time. Allan, thanks so much. Is there anything I didn't ask you that you wish that I had? Anything else you'd like to say?
No, let's not let this happen. Let's get together again soon. It's been too long since we chatted about these matters. So looking forward to it.
Great to reconnect, Allan. Great to talk with you. And thanks so much for being on the pod.
Thanks, Doug.
Thank you for listening to the Energy Capital Podcast. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, please like, rate, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Until next time, have a great day.